friend, welcome to my kitchen. Today we are going to be making a sourdough loaf that you can make in the evening and bake in the morning. You do not need to revolve around your sourdough. It can revolve around your schedule as long as you know how to use your fridge. So that's what I want to teach you today. Let's get started.
I always like to start by measuring everything with a scale because it's most accurate to bake with. It guarantees consistent results. So for this recipe, we're making 2 loaves. I use 720 grams of filtered water. And a quick tip, if you want to speed up the fermentation process, try a little bit of warm water. And next, you're gonna add your active starter. I added 190 grams this time. Usually I do 100 grams per loaf, so that would be 200, but I found my loaves ferment pretty quickly, even in the fridge, so I reduce it slightly this time. Whisk the starter into your water until it's nice and foamy, and that's when you know it's well incorporated. Then go ahead and add your salt. I use 22 grams, 11 per loaf. My favorite is pink Himalayan sea salt because I think it has amazing flavor. Just be sure to use a fine salt, not coarse, otherwise you'll end up with gritty spots in your crumb, and that's yuck. Now we're gonna go ahead and add the flour to the loaves. It's 500 grams per loaf, so a total of 1,000 of a high protein flour. I like to use the King Arthur bread flour. I find it super reliable and the protein content makes it easier to develop a strong gluten structure. If you want to add a little bit of extra flavor, which I oftentimes do, I add about 50 grams of rye flour to that. So it'd be 950 grams of bread flour and 50 grams of rye flour. I think that is a really nice flavor combination. So when you mix your dough, really get your hands in there. This is such an important step, especially if you're new to sourdough, because it teaches you what the dough should feel like. You want to incorporate every bit of flour, no dry spots or clumps left behind as you're mixing, and pay attention how sticky and rough it feels at first, because that texture will completely change as the gluten develops later on. Being familiar with that transformation just makes you a better baker. So after I mixed that dough, I let it sit for 45 minutes before I started this first stretch and fold. That longer rest just gives the flour time to hydrate and the gluten to start forming on its own. A lot of people think you're supposed to do exactly 4 sets and then you stop, but I like to let the dough tell me when it's ready. The key is to gently stretch it until it resists. Don't tear it, just stretch as far as it allows, and when it resists, that's your sign to stop. I do 3 rounds of stretch and folds, 30 minutes apart. With each round, the dough gets smoother, it gets stronger, and you'll notice more resistance, and that's gluten development in action. If you find the dough is really sticky, try wetting your hands before you do your stretch and folds. So this is my last stretch and fold, and you can see that the dough is way smoother. It's way easier to stretch out, but I'm just gonna keep going and stretching the dough until it tells me that it's done. So you'll see every time I pull it, it's harder to get it longer. So it's shorter and shorter and shorter. That's the gluten developing, and eventually I stop here because it's telling me that it doesn't want to stretch anymore and I don't want to tear it. So I'm going to go ahead and place this dough back in the microwave. I love keeping it in there because it's a consistent temperature and it helps maintain that good fermentation so it doesn't take a super long time. So after you finish your stretch and folds, your next thing is focusing on bulk fermentation, and that technically starts as soon as the starter is mixed into the dough. The whole time, even during stretch and folds, your dough is fermenting, and you're looking for a 50 to 75% increase in size. You want to see bubbles forming, a lighter feel in the dough. I like using a glass bowl so I could watch the rise and even see the bubbles underneath. So by this time, it was around 10:30 at night. So it was about 5.5 hours of the whole stretch and folds and then letting it rise, and I didn't feel like shaping it. So I used my fridge. I covered it and put it in there overnight so it didn't overproof. So the next morning, I got to working with my dough around 10 o'clock. So take it out whenever you're ready. You can take it out after work at around 5 o'clock. Your dough will be just fine. But I like to take it out of the fridge and let it sit on the counter. You can also finish the bulk fermentation. If you didn't have your dough rise the full amount and you got tired, you can do that at this point. That's how flexible sourdough is. You don't need to be glued to your bowl, I promise you. So you can see that it rose a little bit more in the fridge, but you want to let it just slide out of the glass container. I'm helping it along the edges here, but you'll see it will just plop out on its own, and that's a great sign that the dough was fermented properly when you don't have a lot of the dough stuck to the bowl afterwards. You want to be really patient with this step and don't tear the dough, because you work so hard to develop that gluten structure and develop that air in the dough. So you can see here it's just, there we go, nice and clean. So when you initially take the dough out of the fridge, just let it sit on the counter for about 25 to 30 minutes before you dump it out of the bowl. That'll make it easier to come out. And then you can go ahead and shape the dough. So like I said, this recipe makes 2 loaves. You're going to do the counter rest here. So you're just going to pull the dough along the counter. You're creating tension on the top of the dough there. And then you're just going to let it sit for around 20 to 30 minutes and allow that gluten to relax, and this makes it much easier to do a nice shaping. So it's been about 20 minutes here, and you can see that the dough is a lot more relaxed. It's way easier for me to go ahead and stretch that dough into a square. I'm going to take the top, fold it down, pull the 2 edges and tuck it in and pinch it. You're going to do that all the way down. You're basically like doing up a jacket all the way down. Once you get to the end, you're going to roll it up nice and tight. Be sure to try and keep as much of that air in the dough. Don't be really rough with it. And then use the counter to pull the dough towards you, creating that tension on the top. I like to use parchment paper when I'm using the inverted bread pan method. So this helps to avoid over browning and avoid the dough from sticking. So the inverted bread pan method is you just put the dough in one, and then you take another bread pan and put it on top, and that captures the steam and replaces a Dutch oven if you don't have one. So for this second loaf, I did a cinnamon sugar loaf. So I'm doing the same thing. I am trying to create a large square. I want it to be a little bit wider this time because I am putting cinnamon sugar in. So I wish that I put some butter in on this, and I think I put way too much sugar because at the end you'll see it's like dripping out. So I would add a little bit of flour into the cinnamon sugar. I did, but I probably add a little bit more. And then I'd put some butter in there as well. But you're going to fold it over in half, put some more of that cinnamon sugar on top, and then fold the other side back on top of it. So you can see I have way too much. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it's too much. I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit more on the top there. That way you get it in all the layers and you're going to get a nice swirl. And yeah, way too much cinnamon sugar. Stop, Ashlyn. Just stop. But you're going to roll it up tight, just like the last one. And just really be gentle with the dough. That way you're not going to remove any of that air that you work so hard to develop during bulk fermentation. You want to try and cover as much of that cinnamon sugar as possible. So that's what I'm trying to do here, is cover as much of that so that it doesn't leak. But yeah, there you go. There's a cinnamon sugar loaf. I'm going to do the same thing, use some parchment paper, and then place that dough in there. And I'm going to use the inverted loaf pan or bread pan method instead of using a Dutch oven. So I like to let my bread rest in my pans just to let them expand and fill the loaf pan. I feel like I get the most symmetrical looking loaves. That way you don't have to do this step. I just like to do it. And so that's what they're looking like right now. I'm going to let them rise just a little bit in the loaf pan before I go ahead and score them. Another trick that I like to do is flash freeze them, because that makes scoring them way easier. So I just put them in the freezer for about 20 minutes before I take them out and then score them. But you can see it goes through the dough way easier this way. If the dough were to be warm, sometimes it pulls and you don't get a nice clean line or a clean incision. So that's a little trick. Put in the freezer for 20 minutes before you score it and you'll get a nice clean incision. Preheat your oven to 450 degrees, and we're going to go ahead and put our inverted loaf pans in there on the middle rack, and we're going to bake it for 30 minutes before we go ahead and take off the top lids and put them at the bottom and bake for an additional 12 to 15 minutes. You're looking for an internal temperature of about 205 degrees. Here's that cinnamon sugar loaf. You can see it literally dripping. Way too much sugar. But these are the finished loaves and they turned out pretty good. Pretty good, I will say.
So let's go ahead and cut these. They're still warm. Technically, you're supposed to wait a little bit longer, but I don't feel like it. We're gonna cut it right away. So this one, I put a lot of cinnamon sugar in, probably a little bit too much, because literally when I took it out of the bread pan, it was dripping. So I might need to adjust the recipe a little bit, but let's see what it looks like inside. See if we got a nice swirl. Can't really see the swirl all that much. You can slightly see it's still hot. But I feel like we have a nice crumb. And yeah, it's good. That's what that one looks like. I feel like if I added a little bit more cinnamon, we would see a more defined swirl. Because I can see where the swirl would be. I think it just needs more cinnamon. All right, there's that one. Nice sticky bread. Let's cut this one right down the middle. This is just a plain loaf. And that's beautiful. All right, so you see, I made this. Well, I wanted to follow your typical 9 to 5. So I made the dough last night around 5-ish. And I ended up letting it, I did my stretch and folds, 3 sets. We let it ferment in the bowl until it basically doubled in size. And then you can go ahead and shape the dough right then and there. However, I was tired. I didn't feel like it. So I covered the dough, put it in the fridge. What the fridge does is it slows things down. So it doesn't completely stop the rise of the fermentation, but it brings it to snail pace. So when I got to it this morning, it was around 9. However, you could do it whenever you want to. You could have left it in the fridge all workday and say you came back the next day at 5:30, and then you wanted to take the dough out and bake it then. You can start this second process when you get home. It works around your schedule, not the other way around. This dough would have been fine in the fridge until 5 o'clock or 5:30 when you got off of work. So I just want you to know you can totally make sourdough around your schedule. It doesn't have to be complicated. You can make delicious tasting bread on a 9 to 5 very easily. So I hope this is encouraging for you, and I hope you give it a try. This is one of my favorite recipes. It's about a 72% hydration, and it creates a really nice moist bread that lasts a while. A trick for storage for this, you can leave it on the counter for up to 3 days. However, I like to go and slice it and then put it in the fridge or in the freezer in a Ziploc bag and take it out and toast it as I want to slice, because I like mine toasted. So that's what I would recommend. Thank you so much for joining me in my kitchen, and I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day. I'll see you in the next one.